Denny Alcorn is 58 years old now. He runs about 900 acres of dryland corn and milo in Kiowa County, Kansas, and he does it without a propane contract, which in the grain drying business is roughly the equivalent of saying he does it without shoes. People in the county have stopped asking him how. They know how. They just still find it a little hard to believe. But on the fourth Saturday of October 2019, Denny Alcorn was a man with a bad harvest, a worse operating loan, and a pickup truck driving a route through 5 neighboring counties asking strangers if he could have their junk. He was 53 years old. He had 12 blown engine blocks, 0 explanation for what he intended to do with them, and a grain dryer that had eaten $4,800 in propane the previous fall and was going to eat more this year if he let it. He was not going to let it. Most people who watch stories like this scroll past without ever subscribing. But if you've ever been underestimated, talked over, or dismissed because of how little you had to work with, stay with us. Subscribe. This one is for you. Harmon Getz had been shoeing horses in Kiowa County for 31 years before his back finally told him it was done. And in the years since he retired, he had developed the habit of showing up at the Pratt & Whitney Co-op elevator in Greensburg on Saturday mornings to drink coffee and watch what came through the lot. This was not unusual. Retired men in small Kansas counties do this the way retired men in cities go to the gym. It gives the morning a shape and costs nothing, and involves people you have known long enough to know what they are actually saying when they say what they say. The fourth Saturday of October 2019 was clear and cold. That particular Kansas fall cold that arrives after the first hard frost and turns the sky a shade of blue that doesn't exist in other seasons. Pale and wide and too high up. The air smelled like cut stalks and anhydrous from the field application going on 2 miles east. The particular smell of a Kiowa County October that Harmon had been breathing since 1978 and had never once found a good way to describe. He had his coffee. He was watching the lot. What he saw was a flatbed trailer come off the highway and pull into the gravel apron beside the elevator. The truck was a 2008 Ford F-350, white, with a dent in the passenger door that looked like it had been made by a gatepost and had been there long enough that it was nobody's priority anymore. The man who got out was lean, somewhere in his 50s, wearing a Carhartt jacket that had been washed enough times to go soft. He was carrying a notebook. He crossed the lot and introduced himself to the 3 men standing near the bin fans as Denny Alcorn from out near Haviland. He said he'd heard they had some blown engine blocks behind the shop, and he wondered if he could take them off their hands. Harmon watched the 3 men look at each other. He watched one of them, Terry Mines, who ran the elevator and who had been running it since his father retired in 2004, glance at the other 2 with a particular expression that was not quite a smile. He watched Terry Mines laugh. Not loud, but the way a man laughs when something confirms his sense of how the world is organized. He said Denny was welcome to them, and that he hoped whatever he was building was worth the fuel to haul them. Denny said he thought it might be. Harmon watched Denny walk to the back of the shop. He watched him look at the 3 blocks, 2 V8s from old grain trucks, and one off a Caterpillar 3304 that had failed in a combine in 2011 and been sitting under a blue tarp since. He watched Denny crouch down next to the Caterpillar block and look at it for a moment and write something in the notebook. Harmon said later he didn't know what Denny was building at that point. He just noticed that Denny didn't appear to mind being laughed at, which in Harmon's experience was either a sign of a fool or a sign of a man who already knew something the laughing man didn't. He had met a few of each in 31 years of driving to farms and being the one person with a skill everyone needed and nobody wanted to pay for. He had a decent sense of which was which. He stayed to watch. Kiowa County sits in the south-central part of Kansas, in the long flat country that runs down toward the Oklahoma line and doesn't change its mind about being flat until you're well into Oklahoma. It has about 2,400 people in an area just under 1,000 square miles, which works out to enough space that a man can live there his whole life and still have neighbors he has never formally met. The county seat is Greensburg, which most people know as the town the 2007 tornado took apart, and which rebuilt itself afterward in a way that got written about in national publications, though the people who did the rebuilding found the writing about part somewhat beside the point. The farming in Kiowa County is dryland farming, no irrigation, which in western Kansas is a distinction that matters. The rainfall averages 22 inches per year, which is enough for wheat and milo and modest corn yields in a good year, and in a bad year the average becomes a memory. The county has a relationship with drought that is not occasional, but structural, built into the economics of every operating loan and every crop insurance policy and every calculation a man makes in February about what he can afford to plant and what he cannot. Denny Alcorn had farmed dryland ground in Kiowa County for 28 years. He had inherited 240 acres from his father-in-law in 1997 and had added to it across 2 decades, 40 acres here, a quarter section there, in the way that careful dryland farmers build ground, slowly when the math held, with operating loans that felt manageable at the time of signing. By 2019, he was at 900 acres, which in a good year covered the notes and put something away, and in a bad year did neither of those things. 2018 had been a bad year. A late spring frost wiped out his first wheat planting. A dry July that cracked the subsoil put his corn yield at 94 bushels per acre when he had budgeted 130. The operating loan from United Prairie Bank in Pratt had come due in January of 2019, and Denny had paid it. Barely. But the conversation with his loan officer, a careful man named Glenn Hartsook who had been working Denny's account for 9 years, had been different that year. Not hostile. Not threatening. Just careful in a way that had not been there before, the way a bank is careful when it has started doing arithmetic it does not share with you. The propane bill from the 2018 drying season had been $4,800. Denny had written the check. He had held it for a moment, longer than a person holds a check when they are simply going to mail it. He already knew what propane drying cost per bushel. Somewhere between 9 and 14 cents depending on starting moisture and ambient temperature. His dryer was a 1994 Giese model, direct fire propane burner, 10 horsepower electric fan, the kind of unit that had been standard issue on mid-size Kansas grain farms since the 1980s. It worked. It was paid for, but the propane contract was a fixed cost that arrived every fall regardless of what corn was trading at, and in a year when corn closed at $3. 65 a bushel, and his yield was already 30% short of plan. 14 cents a bushel in drying cost was a number that sat with a man. He started the notebook in January of 2019. By October, he had an answer. And an answer that needed 12 blown engine blocks that he did not have. The answer was not complicated in principle. It was complicated in execution, which is true of most answers that hold up. Cast iron holds heat. It holds it longer and releases it more steadily than almost any material available to a man who is not spending manufacturing money. A blown engine block is dead as an engine and worthless as machinery. But it is still a precision casting of dense iron, somewhere between 150 and 250 pounds depending on the engine, with thick walls, flat machine surfaces, and zero propensity to degrade from temperature cycling. Put enough of that iron in an insulated enclosure. Face the enclosure south with glazing that lets sunlight in and keeps convective heat loss out. The iron heats during the day. It stores. After dark, It gives that heat back slowly and evenly into whatever air you move across it. Move that air through grain and you have a dryer. Not a fast dryer. Not a dryer that takes corn from 25% moisture to 14% in 6 hours the way a propane direct fire unit does. A slow dryer. One that takes 2, 3, sometimes 4 days to accomplish what a propane dryer does in an afternoon. But a dryer that costs, once built, essentially nothing to run, and that runs on resources a broke dryland farmer in Kiowa County, Kansas, happened to have. Sunlight, which is not in short supply, and cast iron, which nobody wanted. The grain drying equipment industry would tell you this approach is impractical at commercial scale. Denny had read what the industry said and had a few thoughts about the industry's relationship to propane suppliers and equipment financing, and the definition of commercial scale, which he kept in the notebook and did not discuss at the co-op on Saturday mornings. He did the math himself. At 900 acres averaging 120 bushels, he was moving somewhere around 108.00 bushels through the dryer in a wet year. At 12 cents a bushel in propane, that was $12,960 per year. Every year. Against that, he set his estimate for building a solar thermal mass dryer scaled to his volume, lumber, glazing, insulation, hardware. He came out at about $3,200 in hard costs. And that number assumed he got the iron for nothing. He needed 12 blocks, minimum. He drove to 5 counties to get them. He loaded the 3 blocks from the Pratt & Whitney lot himself, which was not the kind of job that gets easier when you are 53 years old, but which Denny had worked out a system for. A come-along anchored to the trailer's headboard. A 4-foot section of 3-inch steel pipe as a roller. The same method his father had used to move heavy things when there was no other way and no one available to help. It took about 40 minutes per block, and he did not rush it. The Caterpillar 3304 went last and was the heaviest of the 3, and Denny had to re-rig the come-along twice before he got it onto the deck. Terry Mines watched him load from the door of the elevator office. He did not offer to help, which Denny did not hold against him. It was not his load to move. Harmon Getz watched from the lot. When Denny was strapping the last block down, Harmon walked over with his coffee cup and said he had 2 blocks at his own place from an old Case 580 backhoe he had been meaning to clean up for 4 years. He said Denny could have them if he'd explain what they were for. Denny explained it. Standing in the gravel lot in the cold, with the wind off the wheat stubble to the west, he told Harmon what he was building and why and roughly how he expected it to work. Harmon listened to all of it. He was quiet for a moment after. "My neighbor's got a blown 466 International off a semi," he said, "sitting in the weeds. Been there since Clinton was president." Denny said a 466 block would work. Harmon said he'd make a call. Terry Mines was still standing in the door of the office. He had heard most of it. He didn't say anything. He went back inside. He would mention it to Harmon the following October, when the thing had been running for a year, that he hadn't said anything because he hadn't known what to say. He said it hadn't sounded right to him. He said a lot of things that turned out to be true hadn't sounded right to him at first. Harmon said he'd noticed that about Terry over the years. The structure went up over 3 weekends in November, and 1 long weekend the first week of December. Built against the south wall of the machine shed, where it would receive the low winter sun without shade obstruction, and where the existing concrete pad gave Denny a foundation without pouring one. The frame was 2x6 pine. The glazing was twin-wall polycarbonate sheeting, the kind used in greenhouse construction, clear enough to transmit about 82% of incident solar radiation and durable enough to hold up to hail. Bought in 4 sheets from a farm supply in Wichita for a total of $380. The insulation was 2-inch polyisocyanurate board on the north wall and ceiling, salvaged from a commercial building teardown in Pratt that Denny had read about in 3 lines of the county paper and had called about within the hour. The blocks went in on a bed of concrete board to protect the slab, stacked in 2 rows with 3-inch gaps between them for the air to move through. 12 blocks total, the 3 from Greensburg, 2 Case 580 backhoe blocks from Harmon, the 466 International, which Harmon's neighbor, a man named Roy Schiffler who ran cattle east of Mullinville, drove over on a Sunday with a tractor and a loader because the block was too big for a pickup, and 6 more gathered from a machine shop in Medicine Lodge and a farm equipment auction in Comanche County, where they'd been sitting on a shipping pallet with a handwritten $20 sticker and no takers since the previous spring. Total paid for iron, $20. The air system was a 1-horsepower blower motor, a replacement part for a 1997 Case IH 2388 Combine, bought for $40 at a salvage sale in Pratt, mounted to pull air across the blocks and push it through a sheet metal plenum into the existing grain bin through the aeration floor tubes Denny already had in place under the Gaxi system. The whole electrical load was 750 watts. His solar array, which he had installed in 2016 to offset the house meter and which reliably produced more on a clear October day than the house consumed, ran the fan without drawing a watt from the grid. The operating cost, once the structure was built, was 0. He ran his first test load in the first week of December 2019. 2,000 bushels of corn he had stored green in the bin at 17. 8% moisture, a calculated risk in December in Kansas, where the cold holds spoilage back for a while, but not indefinitely. He ran the fan during daylight hours and shut it down at dark, when the iron was giving back what it had stored but the gain from running air had diminished below useful. He measured the grain moisture with a hand probe every 12 hours, at 6 in the morning and 6 at night, and he wrote every reading in the notebook. The load came to 14. 2% in 61 hours of runtime spread across 4 days. No propane. No cost beyond the 40 hours of his own attention. He ran the results again on a piece of paper before he was satisfied. He was not the kind of man who announced things before he was sure. He ran a second test in January, another 2,000 bushels, this time wetter, 19% starting moisture, which is the kind of corn you get in a wet October, and which a propane dryer handles in a long afternoon at considerable expense. The solar system took 92 hours over 6 days. It stayed within the spoilage window, still no propane. He ran his complete 2020 harvest, 89,000 bushels of corn and milo at an average starting moisture of 16, 4% through the system between October and January. He moved it all to a consistent 14, 0%. Propane cost for the 2020 drying season, nothing. Fan electricity, drawn from the existing solar array, nothing marginal. Total cash outlay for drying 89,000 bushels, 0. He called it 400 hours of his own labor managing the loads. He did not call the propane company at all. Glenn Hartsook at United Prairie Bank noticed the change before Denny mentioned it. The 2020 operating loan review was a different conversation than 2019 had been. The margin had improved in ways that the yield numbers alone didn't explain. Glenn asked what had changed, and Denny told him about the dryer, plainly, with the notebook open on the desk between them, with the moisture logs and the build costs and the 2020 season results. Glenn listened to all of it. He asked if it would scale. Denny said he didn't know. He said it scaled to his operation, which was the only one he was responsible for. Glenn looked at the notebook for a moment. He said he'd like to show it to someone at the Kansas State Extension Office if Denny didn't mind. Denny said he didn't mind. He did not hear back from the extension office. He did not follow up. That was not his department. The story got out the way stories get out in small Kansas counties, which is one person telling one other person in a place where there are more ears than the two of them. Harmon Getz mentioned it at the co-op elevator the following October, which was probably inevitable. By spring of 2022, Denny had fielded calls from 3 operators in Pratt County, 1 in Comanche County, and 1 man out near Liberal who had heard about it through a chain of telephone that had passed through at least 2 counties Denny could not trace. He answered all of them. He did not charge for the conversation. He sent 2 of them a photograph of the structure and a page from the notebook with the key dimensions written out. He kept the notebook. The XC dryer is still in the machine shed. Denny has not sold it. In 2022, when October brought 3 consecutive weeks of cloud cover and intermittent rain, and the iron couldn't absorb what wasn't coming in, he ran about 8,000 bushels through the propane unit. The bill was $470. He did not complain about it. The system is not a religion. It is a tool. And a tool has limits, and a man who understands his tools understands their limits. The solar thermal system has been running without a meaningful repair since December of 2019. The twin-wall polycarbonate glazing yellowed in its 3rd year, which reduced light transmission by an amount Denny measured with a solar meter borrowed from the county extension office and found acceptable. The blocks have not moved. Cast iron, it turns out, requires very little from you when all you are asking it to do is sit still and be warm. Harmon Getz stopped by the shed that first fall to look at it. He had stopped by a few times in the month since the parking lot in Greensburg, for reasons he would have been hard-pressed to explain precisely. He stood at the glazing and looked in at the blocks stacked in the afternoon light, at the duct running up to the bin, at the whole arrangement that had started as something a man had laughed at in a gravel lot. He said he couldn't decide if it was obvious or not, whether someone should have thought of it a long time ago, or whether it was the kind of thing that only seems obvious after the fact. Denny said he wasn't sure either. He said he just looked at the propane bill long enough that eventually something else started to look possible. Harmon thought about that. He held his coffee with both hands the way he did when it was cold. He said he supposed that was how most things got figured out. Denny said he supposed it was. He wrote that down too.